because the car only weighed 600 pounds, no kilos, no pounds. I think it's pounds, I can't remember. I always forget these metric things. Let's move on to the next section. Hello and welcome to another installment of the Car Nerd. I am Jason Hassett, the aforementioned Car Nerd, and today we're going to be talking about something very different for this channel, which is Formula 1. But like every other episode, we're going to mainly be talking about a particular car in history, and that's what this channel is all about. So today, that is the Renault RS01, Renault's first actual introduction into Formula 1 racing, which didn't quite go to plan, but it did get the world onto the 80s era of turbocharged Formula 1 cars, which were so powerful that it caused them to be completely banned outright from Formula 1 in 1989. Before we jump into it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, let me know in the comments what cars you would like to see, or if you're reading us on Drive Tribe, you can do it in the comments there as well. Thank you so much, and let's jump into it. So in 1977, Renault set up subsidiary Renault Sport, and their whole idea was to basically enter into racing to test out new engine models that they could bring into the production series of their cars. So what they wanted to do was bring in a new turbocharged engine. Now before this time there were turbo engine cars, but turbo engine cars were not massively popular. And because of this and because of something else that Renault did, you'll see that Renault and other cars turbocharging in the late 70s, early 80s became the fad. Everybody loved the idea. And this is usually what happens in racing. When something's popular in racing, it tends to become popular in normal commercial cars, which is why most of these manufacturers go racing in the first place. It's not about the investment into the cars for racing's sake. It's because if you win a race, then your cars become inherently more popular. So this is what they wanted to do. They wanted to enter into Formula F1 for the very first time. And to do this, they had a look at the regulations, and essentially the rules from 1966 on engines were that you had to use a 3-litre naturally aspirated engine that could not be turbo or supercharged, which put the turbocharging out of the rulebook. However, there was a clause in there that said if you wanted to use a supercharged or a turbocharged engine, you had to drop that to 1.5 litres. So with the RS01, Renault took this whole idea and decided they were going to create a turbo engine car. However, it didn't quite go well for them the first year. So they showed up in the first year in the British Grand Prix. Was their first race. So they had missed the first 5 races of the World Championship in 1977. And they also missed 2 after that before going on to do another 2 and then leaving for the end of the year without finishing the last one. They also only entered one driver, Jean-Pierre Jabiel. That's close enough. So Jean-Pierre, who I'm going to call him from now on, Jean-Pierre was the only driver. So this was a very weird time in Formula 1, because nowadays if you want to enter a Formula 1 race, you have to join for the entire season, show up for every single race, and have at least 2 cars. So some teams have 4 cars, like Red Bull now, for example, and they have 2 teams actually. But generally speaking, back then, you could kind of just waft in and out whenever you wanted, as long as you had the money on the car. So this is exactly what Renault did, because they didn't actually give a shit, to be honest with you, about winning races. They just wanted to test this new engine. So Jean-Pierre's first race was the British Grand Prix in 1977, and he started off after qualifying in 21st place, and he moved all the way up to 16th and was doing really, really well. He was on the heels of James Hunt for a lot of this time, an incredible racing driver, until lap 17 when the turbo failed, and that was the first in a long list of issues. So because of the turbo failure, they went back and started working on the engine and the car again, and they missed the Austrian and the German Grand Prix, and then they came back for the Dutch Grand Prix. Things got even worse for Jean-Pierre after this. He went on then to the Dutch Grand Prix, and in the Dutch Grand Prix, the suspension failed on lap 40, and that put him out of the race, which was really annoying for the Renault team because they had got up to 6th position. They were doing really, really well. And then in the United States Grand Prix, they got to lap 24 before the engine failed again with another turbo failure. And then in Italy, they got to lap 40 before having an alternator failure, and then they didn't qualify for the Canadian Grand Prix, and at that point they decided not to bother showing up for the Japanese Grand Prix, and just left it at that. They did come again for the 78 Grand Prix though. They weren't done. And there's a big reason that they weren't done here. And the reason for that is not only were they entering Formula 1 for the first time, sorry about the dog barking, they also entered Le Mans for the first time. And in their Le Mans season, they had done a lot better. So they had come second in Le Mans in 77. Which is a big flag to them that the engine could be reliable. Now, they were using a 2-litre version of the engine in Le Mans, but it was essentially the same thing. And in 78, they won the Le Mans Championship. So this proved entirely that not only were these engines powerful, they could be reliable. So back they came in 1978, and they decided to enter all the races once again and try out with an updated version of their car, of the RS01. Unfortunately for them, they didn't do quite well. However, the Monaco Grand Prix was the first time that the car actually finished a race. Now, it finished in 10th, but this was kind of a turning point for the company and for the team. So after finishing that race in Monaco, things went up from there. So then in 79, they raced the car again until eventually they had an upgraded version of this car called the RS10. And the RS10 and the RS01, the only difference was that the RS01 had a problem with boost, which is when you have a turbocharger, it takes a while for the turbocharger to kick in. It has to generate what's called a boost, which is where the air is coming in and being compressed and then let into the turbocharger. So you need to compress quite a lot of air first and then let it out. So it had a turbo lag of 1.5 seconds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but you got to keep in mind 1.5 seconds might as well be a year in something as fast as Formula 1. So they got around this in the RS10, the updated version of the RS01, by adding twin turbochargers, which could boost at different rates or at different times to just get rid of that turbo lag. So essentially one would boost up but not fire, and then with the other one boost up, and then you had a reserve one. And essentially this is done with a lot of cars now with twin turbochargers. And the RS10 is the turning point for them in Formula 1, purely because the RS10, essentially in South Africa, the race was on high altitude, and when you're at high altitude, most of the competition were running, all of the competition were running naturally aspirated engines, and therefore what happened was they were losing about 20 to 25% of their power because of the thinner air. It was less dense, whereas the turbochargers didn't matter because they would just collect air and compress it and fire it in, so they would only lose at most 5% of their power. And in the South African Grand Prix of 79, they destroyed everyone. And this was when everyone else decided to start using these engines, and we had the crazy time in the 80s of Formula 1 cars with 1300 horsepower on turbos, until eventually the FIA said no mas and killed it off by banning turbochargers in 1989. The engine that they decided to use was a 1.5 litre version of the 2 litre engine that they had used at Le Mans and come in second place in 1977. This was a V6 1.5 litre engine producing 525 horsepower at 10,500 RPM. It's quite a quick engine, especially for the time. You got to keep in mind this is the 80s. Now basically every other manufacturer was using the regulation stock 3 litre displacement engines, such as the Cosworth engines, which were quite popular. So essentially every other manufacturer during this time had the 3 litre Cosworth engines, and they were in and around 500 horsepower as well. The difference with these were, even though this first one was 525 horsepower, by the time in 79 the RS10 came out with the twin turbos, you were getting above 700 horsepower, and then this went into 1300. And Renault knew this. They knew that the turbochargers could be tuned up and pack more power, but they were just trying to find something reliable at first. So the only other ones in that period who weren't using Cosworth engines were Renault with this new turbo, and also with Ferrari had their flat 12 unit. So as I said, this was a V6, and it was capable of pushing the car to 300 kilometers an hour because the car only weighed 600 pounds, no kilos, no pounds. I think it's pounds, I can't remember. I always forget these metric things. Let's move on to the next section. One other technical advantage that this car had over the rest of the cars on the field in 77 was it was the first of these cars to use radial tires. Now, radial tires at the time were relatively new, and if you don't know what radial tires are, essentially what they are is, in most tires underneath the thread, the actual wall or carcass of the tire, as it's called, has cross beads, right? Okay, so essentially what that is inside you have like these layers underneath, and in a normal tire known as a bias tire, I believe, I can't remember now, anyway it'll be on screen, they have tire treads that go across this way in the carcass, and then other ones on top that go across this way, so they're like in a cross section. Now with radial tires, they go straight across from one side to the other, and then there's another one running across this way, as in like over it. So essentially they're just cross with this. Now that doesn't sound like a huge difference, and I'll put up graphics on screen when I'm editing this to make it more obvious, because my explanation there was terrible. But essentially what this means is the inner tire is able to flex more on a radial tire. Now that doesn't sound like a great thing, you probably don't think tire flexing should be a thing, but in most cars nowadays they use radial tires, and Michelin invented this. At the time of Formula 1 in 1977, every other manufacturer was using Pirelli tires, much like they are today. But the advantage of this flexing is when you have the other tires, the bias tires, or whatever they're called, in a truck with a heavy load you want stiff tires, obviously. But in a car with performance you want tires that can bend and flex. And the reason for this is, one, it gives you better ride quality, obviously. The other one is that it puts more of the rubber on the ground, which in Formula 1 is incredibly important because it gives you more grip. So Renault were the first ones to use these radial tires with Michelin in 1977, and an onlooking Enzo Ferrari and his team figured out what was going on, and they basically straight away ran and picked up Michelin tires for the 78 season. You can't do this anymore now because Formula 1 contracts Pirelli for basically everyone as far as I'm aware, and Pirelli actually collect the tires afterwards to stop anyone re-engineering their tires. So I think you have to rent the tires. Now I'm not sure if that means you can use Michelin. This is an unimportant rant for another time. So as I said, obviously this car in particular wasn't successful, but it was never meant to be. It was an experimental car that went on to make the RS10 and the future of Formula 1 for 10 years onwards, from 1980 until 1989. Turbocharged engines just became crazy, and it was one of those times where you had 1400 horsepower engines because of the turbos running in the 1980s and just destroying it, leaving all the naturally aspirated people behind. But it was an incredible time for change in Formula 1, and obviously in 1989 it was completely banned, no more turbos, and that's when we move on to like the 2000s. As I remember, we had the DRS option and things like that. So Formula 1's always nice to see those things, and I just wanted to do something different here today and talk about a Formula 1 car instead of a normal road car, because I just if I'm honest, I've been watching Formula 1 Drive to Survive. I've been missing Formula 1, so I wanted to catch up on that, and I figured it was just something nice to talk about. So thank you so much for joining me today. If you'd like to see more Formula 1 style content on this channel, please drop a comment in the description. Don't forget to subscribe, and also I would love if you message me or comment on what other cars you'd like to hear the history of. That would be amazing. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Goodbye.